Welcome back to another episode of Treknicity, the show where we talk about everything to do with, of course, Star Trek. I'm Lars Capt, your host, coming to you from somewhere beyond the cosmos, or, in this case, Southern California, because it's weird enough as it is. And joining me again for this episode in which we will talk about things regarding canon in both the Prime universe, the Abrams universe, and all of the productions therein, will be my co-host and seemingly new companion, the Captain. But of course, we have to bring him forth in the manner which is prescribed by saying his name 3 times. So let's get down to the rat killing. Frank.
Of course you can visit your friend on the Union ship.
Thank you. Okay. Hi. Did we catch you at a bad time?
Well, it seems like you're almost always interrupting something, but such is the nature of the show, I guess.
I would agree with that. Yes, we are good at interrupting things. Sometimes good at interrupting ourselves.
Yeah. I had a crewman that wanted to go visit a distant cousin, Mr. And so I sent him off to go visit.
All right, then. Well, I guess the good thing is that he got off to where he's going, and yes, well, so in this episode, we're going to talk about, and I'm going to fidget here a little bit because for some reason I'm in a fidgeting mood. We're going to talk about basically what is considered canon, things that have been retconned, stuff that has been picked up out of fan fiction and then somehow made its way into canon. And so on and so forth. So yeah, I figured we would have a discussion about that. How do you feel about that topic?
Not a problem. I could probably give a more realistic perspective, at least from my world, about how all that canon and stuff went together and what really happened.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what. I entitled this episode "Not with My Star Trek." I think because that's going to highlight my position on things. Primarily regarding the fact that I have taken exception with some of the ways that they've altered canon, primarily through retcons or through rebooting the entire universe altogether. But then again, hey, it's one of those things that they do, and we have to accept that they are in existence. We don't necessarily have to like them; we just have to accept that they are there.
And whether or not we call them canon, I think kind of after a while becomes more subjective, doesn't it? Because if it belongs to the people that are putting it out, and the people that are putting it out are calling it canon, then that makes it canon.
Exactly. That's the thing, is something that I have to remind myself about, is that regardless of whether I like it or not, if the people who created the content are the people who are paid to create the content, technically it's canon. Although it could be changed up a little bit. I mean, we've seen situations, we've seen entire franchises completely ignore sequels in order to rewrite the canon. The Terminator franchise is a great example of that, where following Terminator 2 Judgment Day, we had Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, we had Terminator Salvation, and then we ended up having Terminator Genesis. And of course, because the people who originally worked on the franchise or developed the franchise took back over for Genesis, they completely ignored what took place in 3 and the 4th movie and the TV series that came out. So, I mean, again, you have to accept that some things are going to change. For me, change is a difficult thing. That's primarily because I'm getting older. But,
You're getting older. Have you looked at me lately? I'm not exactly what you'd call a spring chicken.
You're true, and I've seen some spring chickens. Tasty.
I'm definitely not one of them.
So yeah, I mean the big thing is that I know that I'm not really that big on change, so I have to be willing to try to look at this logically a little bit. But of course, I'm going to have my gripes. There's just no ways about it. I'm going to have my gripes.
I think that when you get attached to any franchise or series of stories or just anything in general, you're going to have your gripes if it gets messed with too much or if somehow it starts to take a shape that in a lot of ways may seem unfamiliar to you.
Indeed.
Now, as far as where I look at these things, if J.J. Abrams had the right to do Star Trek movies from Paramount, who had the movie licensing rights, and therefore were able to state whether this does or does not belong to Star Trek, and it belonged, it's still technically canon, even though it's in an alternate universe. Now, do we have to accept that as connected to our original programs, the original series, Next Gen, DS9, and so on? No, not at all. But it's still technically canon, whether we like it or not. And I think sometimes you just need to sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride, even though there are going to be a few bumpy parts you don't really care for.
Well, the thing is that I think for us, I guess more purist fans, what we don't like is the fact that they spent so long building this wonderful myriad of a universe for us to enjoy and to explore, and they changed so many things that we didn't feel needed to be changed. They retconned a lot of stuff. One thing that you'll see in series like say spin-off series like The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise, is that for the most part, like they go to great lengths to try to make everything that happens there fit with what came before it. Um, they didn't have to retcon a whole lot of things, even with Enterprise when they brought the Romulans, they went to great lengths to say, hey, we're not going to show their faces because we know that humans never saw Romulans, at least in the face, until Balance of Terror during Kirk's time. So, okay,
Right, there
we're
was
going to.
some dialogue there that says we've never seen a Romulan face to face or words to that effect within the dialogue.
Exactly.
Now, what about the retconning of the Klingons, though? I mean, yeah, granted, it was mostly a makeup change, and that's pretty much it, but that was even within the regular TOS grouping. The same people, the same stars, the same actors, a lot of the same production team.
Well, and I can understand that. I can understand people saying, well, hey, they made a major change with the Klingons. You're right. They changed them from basically Puerto Ricans and gold lame to zombie death metal, heavy metal musicians. Um, but if you were looking at it from the perspective that they were taking something that they couldn't really do that much with back in the 60s, and they brought a fresh perspective on it. I can see it from the things that it made it more interesting. It opened up the universe for more of a development of the race in general. And the one thing that they did finally do in the fourth season of Enterprise is that they went back and they found a way to make the story make sense. The difference, they found a way to make the difference make sense.
Augmentation from eugenics people.
Correct. They were
Uh,
trying to make their own Klingon augments, and in fact introduced a virus which attacked at the DNA level of the host, and you had several Klingons die, but also the ones who survived were subjected to cranial reconstruction due to genetic changes due to the virus. Um, so, people, and the thing is, people could say, oh, yeah, whatever. They're just looking for a way to justify the change they made that we didn't like. And I understand that. I actually do understand how some people feel that way. What I don't like is that people who make these big changes without any kind of explanation, either before or after, they're just like, we're doing it and you're going to like it. And it's like, oh, hang on a second. We understand that this is your intellectual property, but without us, there would be nobody to appreciate the intellectual property. So all we're asking is for you to not treat us like we're idiots. We talked about things. I mentioned it in the opening of the episode that there are different kinds of material that have shown up throughout different movies, series that weren't initially, they weren't stipulated through the normal progression of the original series TV show. Things like Uhura's first name being Yoda. I believe that either was brought up or was thought of during a novel. There was a novel, I think, that where it was mentioned, or it actually came out in fan fiction.
According to what I had read somewhere, it actually debuted in Star Trek the Animated Series, as did James Tiberius Kirk.
Okay. Now, the animated series, and this is a conversation that you and I have had off Subspace Radio a number of times, is that I don't feel that the series was as good as they could have been. I understand that Gene Roddenberry was kind of behind it, but in later years kind of distanced himself from it. And yes, I mean, I understand that a lot of the original actors came back and reprised their roles in an animated
All
film.
of them but Chekhov, I think.
Okay. So that's cool that they wanted to continue Star Trek. But it's one of those things where nobody can seem to make up their mind as to what is canon and what's not. So of course the fact is that everybody, or at least Paramount says no, this is not canon. I don't care whether Roddenberry liked it or not. It's not canon. We own the IP. No. But of course they picked up pieces out of it later on and used them in the Abrams verse again, like Uhura's first name
and Kirk's middle name.
Right. Now, Kirk's middle name, I'm willing to admit ignorance on this one. I don't remember the first time we saw it outside of the animated series. I don't remember if it was actually
Where No Man Has Gone Before with Gary Mitchell.
Oh,
he made a grave for his old friend, if you recall, but it had a different initial. It was James R. Kirk. Now, novelizations later explained what the initial was for, and it was some sort of prank or nickname or something. I don't know what that was, but that was the first time Kirk was given a middle name.
Okay. Well, yeah, that actually, now that you say that, I remember reading about that at one point. The big thing is that I feel like they go and they retcon things that don't need to be touched. I mean, does it hurt that Uhura has a first name? Of course not. But did they need to do it? Probably not. Star Trek V, they retconned in the fact that Spock had a brother, a half brother.
Yeah, technically a half brother, Sybok. Now, they didn't really explain any of that in the course of any of the previous movies or in any of the shows that came before it.
And I don't think they really ever mentioned much of it afterwards either.
It was just kind of like a one-off idea, which isn't necessarily a bad one. I mean, when we think about a passionate Vulcan, that's something interesting and I think worth exploring. However, didn't we kind of end up with passionate Vulcans with the Romulans?
We did, and the thing is, we knew that already. I mean, by the time Kirk versus God comes out in 1989, the Romulans are already much more developed than even we saw in the original series. Although there was um, in the Next Generation episode where the Romulans make a return. Um, Counselor Troy, I had to laugh. Counselor Troy's description of them just made me laugh. Just 1 minute they're tender, one next minute they're aggressively violent, and I'm like, you make them
That's passion for you.
yeah, but you make them sound like they're like they're schizophrenic. They're not.
No real emotional compass. They just pop off with whatever happens to come up at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, like, it must have like a wheel, like the wheel of emotion.
There you go.
Ding.
And today's emotion is I'm pissed off.
Right.
But then again, that's pretty much the standard setting with my emotion wheel.
Yeah. I think we all need an emotion wheel. That way people could at least see what's going on. Or like a little badge or something that shows us on there, today, hello, today.
I went through that once.
Yeah, you did. I remember. Wait, hang on.
I went through that once. I had a lovely little shirt in a few lives that I sometimes care not to remember ago, where, it told me where I was, or it told you where I was, or my audience, or whatever, but it was kind of like a mood ring.
Yeah, I remember stories about that. Oh, such stories. Anyways.
Too much for your tender ears, young man.
Hey, I'm 45 years old, I'll have you know.
Well, that's right. You are, aren't you?
Yeah.
I keep forgetting humans age differently in your time.
Yeah. Oh, time goes that way for you guys.
It sometimes goes even worse.
Yeah. So back on the topic of retconning and what is acceptable as canon and what is not. Look, to be truthfully honest, there are going to be people that will accept, they'll accept canon changes without so much as bat an eyelash. Just won't even.
I'm usually one of them because I'm willing to look at something from a fresh or new perspective. That's why, although there was no mention of Cybok prior to or after, I still thought it was a movie worth watching. It was a topic worth exploring. It was one I actually liked.
I mean, the whole idea of Kirk versus God, and then having Scotty basically be a bumbling buffoon, and Uhura kind of, in love with Scotty. I don't know.
You gotta remember, he wasn't actually God. He was some sort of ultra powerful alien prisoner who tried to pass himself off as God.
Right. I get that. But the thing is that it was the general premise is that it was supposed to be Kirk versus God. And originally that they had posed that idea when they were bouncing around, the script and everything. They actually considered having it be Kirk versus God. But of course, Star Trek is supposed to be largely non-denominational when it comes to, or at least non-religious, full stop.
Depends on where you look at it. If you go back to the original series, Who Mourns for Adonis, there was another episode where they were taking on Apollo, who was kind of a quote-unquote god, and was talking about all the old gods, and Kirk had said something about we have outgrown them, we find the one sufficient.
True. That was largely due to Gene Roddenberry. But since then, they've gone out of their way to kind of distance the Star Trek universe away from organized religion. I mean, having faith in one omnipotent being, such as the being known as God, is, it's sort of the, um, it's okay because you're not really promoting organized religion, and that's what they're trying to stay away from.
And I don't think organized religion was being promoted in Who Mourns for Adonis either. He was merely saying that the humans have outgrown the need for the super beings, these so called gods, to be granting our every, meeting our every need and blah.
Right. Speaking of omnipotent beings, and this was a discussion we had recently. There is, of course, the entity known as Q, and then the Squire of Gothos, which I have now dubbed Cunyer.
Uh huh.
Of course, that character of Trelane, the Squire of Gothos, the Q continuum had never been imagined when that episode had been written and filmed and aired. Some 40 years before it, before the existence of Q.
But the Q continuum could very easily have been thought of as a retcon of Cunier's appearance, because he had these couple of whatever they were, baubles of light that were his parents.
Yes.
And took his pets away from him or whatever.
Yes, I still remember the Futurama episode where No Fan Has Gone Before parodied that with Melvar being this omnipotent energy being, and they all thought that he was some, ancient, powerful alien, and it turns out he was a 35-year-old man living in his mom's basement. So the idea is that, I mean, look, the idea of Trelane, being a trainee Q or a Q Junior, whatever you want to call him, that one, that retconning, it made sense because it took a story that you could meld together and say, okay, these little elements, these kind of are very similar. It makes sense. You can make the leap of logic. You can take or you can make the suspension of disbelief and say, okay, this makes sense. It's kind of like in Enterprise. They have an episode where they're dealing with the Borg. Well, in Star Trek canon, the Borg had not been encountered by anybody in the Federation or Starfleet until they were, kicked by Q halfway across the galaxy.
Exactly.
But because he did that, they set in motion a chain of events, and which then, of course, the Borg became interested in humanity. Then they go chasing after humanity and try to assimilate them in Best of the Both Worlds Parts 1 and 2, where they assimilate Captain Picard. And then, of course, we get to Star Trek First Contact, where the Borg try again. And this time they succeed in temporarily, and then are defeated, and everything is reversed. But because of that battle that took place around Earth, there were Borg bodies that were still alive but in stasis that had landed in the Arctic. So it makes sense that some years later, when they're exploring the Arctic again, that those bodies would be found, and those events would take place. It's a natural progression. You're not sitting there saying, well, just because we want to put the Borg in this episode, we're just going to magically make it happen. It's not like they just showed up out of nowhere. There is a logical conclusion or logical reasoning for why they got to where they were. So like I said,
because with the movie, they technically first encountered the Borg way back at the beginning of Warp Drive for Humanity.
Right, but the thing is, nobody knew that besides the crew. However, when right before they destroy the Borg cube, a Borg sphere exits the ship, and then they blow that up. And some of the, like, apparently some parts of that ship landed in the Arctic, and there were a couple of Borg drones that survived that crash. They were in stasis because they were injured, but and then they were frozen. But once they were thawed and were able to repair themselves, bang, right there they are. I mean, it makes sense. It's not like they just showed up out of nowhere with no reasoning behind it. They were there because the events that took place in First Contact, which were in the 21st century.
Now there's a retcon all by itself. Let's look at Zephram Cochrane.
Yes.
The first time we saw the character in the original series, not only did he look completely different, but he'd already done left Earth shortly after having developed his warp drive and ran into this thing called the Companion that basically became his entity lover.
Now, if memory serves me correctly, Zephram Cochrane wasn't originally an Earthling. He was originally Alpha Centauran.
That may well be. I'm just saying, though, they had not only a different actor, probably because the original died, but they retconned his personality from what we see in Metamorphosis with the Companion.
I agree. Sometimes a canon change can be very beneficial and be very entertaining. I think the big thing is that they don't take into consideration the differences or the value of what it is to leave something alone. When Denise Crosby left Next Generation, she left because she felt that the series was going to go nowhere, and she didn't want to get caught in a contract that saw her see out a series that was going to fail. And of course,
boy, was she wrong.
She was very wrong, and she understood she was very wrong. And when she came back to them and said, "Hey, look, guys, I made a mistake. Is there any way we can do something?" Of course, they were really, they were actually pretty understanding. They're like, "Look, we get it. We'd love to have you back, but of course, Tasha Yar is dead." And they're like, "Okay, so it is." So they wrote Yesterday's Enterprise so that they could resurrect Tasha Yar.
And have an excuse for her to continue semi-regularly as the new Romulan leader.
Right, Sela, who is Sela was the daughter of Tasha Yar and a Romulan commander. So that being said, again, these are canon changes. These are retcons that happen that make sense. Like they tell an entertaining story. Most of the time they don't. It's a very rare thing that it actually works and they pull it off.
Well, now I have watched all 22 of the animated series episodes. And there are a few other retcons in there. They've got the life support belts. We have our first look at something very similar to what came to be thought of as holodeck technology in the Next Generation. And a lot of people argue whether or not that's canon because of some of these different retcons that occurred within the series. I personally, as I said before, I'm willing to accept it as canon because to me, what they did make sense. It made sense that they might have, say, a life support belt. It made sense to me that in the late 22nd, early 23rd century, they may have already begun experimenting with holographic technology and so on. So to me, a lot of what they did made perfect sense.
Yeah, I can understand that, and I do agree with that. It's just that, I felt like they've retconned some things that they just needed to leave alone.
Now there is one that even I, who am like the ultimate fan in as much as I'm more willing to accept changes, There is one that even I didn't fully understand and just kind of said, okay, I'm going to have to go with this now. And that's the Discovery Klingons.
Oh, yeah. I was leaving, look, to be honest with you, I was leaving Discovery largely alone, but since you cracked that egg, yeah, they're supposed to be in the Prime Universe, yet they treat everything as, well, you know what? If we don't like something, we're just going to completely rewrite it, and you're going to have to like it. And I'm like, no. No.
Now, I don't necessarily think that's their overall attitude. I think what they did when they put the series out is because of the newer technologies available and so on, they wanted to give it a more modern 21st century look as opposed to the old late 20th century look of the original series.
Well, okay, so look at how Enterprise handled it. You know, they knew that the technology didn't exist. It didn't. Um, so instead of, I mean, some people did complain about how it looked overall. They said like, oh wow, it looks too modern for Star Trek. Well, you have to be willing to accept that with um, newer technology available to make the show and whatnot, you're gonna see some newer stuff on the series. You're not gonna get around that. Okay, it makes no sense to make things look like it did in the '60s. Okay, it just doesn't. But when you think about it, Enterprise did a really good job of making things look older. Even like initially the weapons on on Enterprise were lasers. They were missiles. They didn't have shields. They had hull plating polarization. Um, they had, they didn't have phasers. They had phase pistols, and in fact, the phase pistols didn't even show up until the second part of the pilot. Before that, they used plasma pistols. So, you know, given the fact that Discovery is 10 years before Kirk's time, that the technology is more advanced, but it is head and shoulders more advanced than TNG stuff. I'm not talking about just the way it looks, I'm talking about the actual technology. It is head and shoulders above where we saw it in TNG, DS9, Voyager. You know, it's insane. I feel like they really disrespect Trek itself by just saying, "Well, we're gonna put it in there, whatever we want, and you're gonna like it."
Well, again, I'm glad we will have to agree to disagree on that particular thought because I do not believe that's what they did at all. I think that what they wanted to do was do something new that had never quite been done with Star Trek before. And I think they succeeded in doing that. The only real I do have two complaints. I've always had two complaints about Discovery, though. One of which was they seem to follow more along the Abrams verse ideas from the theater, the movies, and two, they didn't write the series nearly as well as it could have or should have been written.
Well, I could agree with those two gripes. Actually, I think that you're right. I think that they could have done a much better job of writing the series, and I feel like they could have been, more faithful to what came before it.
As to the Klingon retcon, that was one there was no explanation for. Most people did not like it. It took me aback when I saw it too. Not because there aren't Klingons that kind of meet that physiognomy, because there are Klingons that meet that. There are Klingons that meet what you think of as the quote unquote Imperials. There are the Klingons that have the more humanoid. They've gone through all these various phases. Now, I will have to say, however, Discovery's timing with that particular look on the Klingons is premature. That happened centuries later.
Yep, I agree. Um, it's one of those things where it was an item that they didn't need to be touched. It could have been kept closer to what we saw in TNG, the DS9, Voyager, Enterprise, so on and so forth. So,
and the rest of the show kind of favored the Abrams verse, but the Klingons really didn't. I don't know what they did in between those to try coming up with the new Klingon makeup.
I don't know.
If we look at Into Darkness, the Abrams verse Klingons, at least they still had like the head ridges and stuff, even though they were now mostly balding and were wearing piercings in their ridges. Right. I think that was probably just more because of the modern era, your modern era that's obsessed with piercings and body art.
Yeah, maybe. But, I guess we could talk about this topic ad nauseum. However, I think the big thing is that we agree that there are some things that should have been left alone, some things that are perfectly okay to have made changes because they better the franchise, and others they just, we never know what's going to happen with it. So, yeah, I mean, I'll be interested to see what else they plan on doing with things, but and especially with the Picard series coming out. So that's going to be really interesting to find out which way they go.
Now, the fact that Patrick Stewart is going to be among the executive staff, that was announced at San Diego Comic-Con, we can probably expect a more Star Trek-ish, as we would remember it from, say, like the late 90s, but a darker turn on the Star Trek-ish kind of program, because that's the direction he wanted to take the character in, and that's the direction the producers promised to take it in when they approached Sir Patrick about playing in the program to begin with.
So I guess we'll just have to see what they do. In the meantime, that is all the time we have for this episode of Treknicity. It has been a pleasure talking to you guys and sharing with you our thoughts and ideas on what makes Trek good and what is not so good about things. And we look forward to talking to you again. Now, we do have an announcement to make, okay? Now, you may remember from our last episode, we had talked about the Red Shirt Geeks 5th anniversary, and we were going to be giving away some items just to say thanks. Well, one thing we have is we have a copy of the 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons module called A Delve in the Cave, written by Jamie Chambers of Signal Fire Studios. And for everybody to be able to have a fair chance at winning these things, we kind of gave it a week, and we felt afterwards that maybe a week wasn't long enough. So we've taken and we've split the 3 prizes into 3 different drawings. And so we're going to do one this week. We're going to do one on our next episode, which is going to be in 3 weeks' time. Okay. And then we're going to do the third one, the episode after that. So if you wouldn't mind, Captain, would you give us a bit of an impromptu drum roll? Thank you.
And the winner is
Jason Gillespie.
Congratulations, Jason.
Yeah. So you get the copy of the 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons module, A Delve in the Cave. That will be coming out to you shortly. We'll be in touch with you. And yeah, in the meantime, I have been Lars, your host here on Treknicity. Joining me as always, is the captain, as he goes by as Frank. So thank you very much for watching, and as always here on Treknicity, rock out with your Spock out. We'll see you next time, folks. Hey guys, it's Lars here. Now that the captain's gone, I just want to let you know that if you want to see more Treknicity, make sure you like and subscribe to the Red Shirt Geeks channel. Hit the subscribe button, ding the little bell so you get the notification when we're going to be butting into your private time. So, alrighty, do it now, do it often. Have fun.